a man by the name of Roy Perez Benavidez. Roy enlisted in the Army in 1952 at the age of 17. In 1965, while serving with the 82nd Airborne in Vietnam, Benavidez stepped on a landmine. He was told that he would never walk again. This dumb Mexican didn't believe the diagnosis, and defying doctor's orders, he began an exercise program on his own. At night, in the darkness, he would slip from his bed, and using his elbows and chin, he would crawl to the nearest wall. He focused his mind through the numbness in his feet and into the pain of his toes until he could move them. Then he moved his ankles, his feet, and eventually he hoisted himself up and stood leaning against the wall. Finally, he walked out of the hospital under his own power. Despite continuing pain from his wounds, he worked hard and finally qualified for Special Forces, the Green Berets. In 1968, he returned to Vietnam.
On the 2nd of May 1968, Benavidez was at the Loc Ninh Green Beret outpost near the Cambodian border attending Mass. At 1:30 p.m., the radio came alive with a panicked request for help. It came from a squad of 12 men, a reconnaissance team that had been dropped by helicopter. The patrol had stumbled upon an entire infantry battalion of the North Vietnam People's Army, the NVA, numbering up to 1,000 men. They had been quickly surrounded. A helicopter had come to extract them. Unable to land, the chopper had lowered 2 ropes for the men to hook onto. As a 4th rescue helicopter was being readied for another attempt, Benavidez jumped on board, armed with only a knife and his medical kit. The chopper reached the site of the engagement. The reconnaissance team was surrounded by the NVA soldiers. Enemy fire prevented an immediate landing, so the aircraft had to move 75 yards away from Leroy Wright and his men. Benavidez jumped to the ground and ran towards the men when a Vietnamese bullet hit him in his right leg. He fell, but was immediately up again and running. Next, it was the full blast of a grenade that slammed him to the ground, his face covered in shrapnel. But this was still not enough to stop him. He got up again and he reached the patrol that had split now into 2 groups. 4 of the Mongas lay dead, and he took one of their AK assault rifles and then focused on treating the wounded. Luckily, he had brought along plenty of morphine for those who were screaming in pain. The only way to stop the overwhelming NVA battalion was to call in an airstrike. Benavidez did so via radio, also requesting another helicopter. Another bullet at this point pierced his right thigh. Thankfully, the oncoming chopper succeeded in landing, and Benavidez dragged the dead and the wounded on board. The NVA soldiers intensified their fire against the aircraft, which prompted another act of sacrifice from Benavidez. Rather than jumping aboard, he ordered the pilot to fly to the second group while he provided suppressive fire from the ground. Benavidez spotted Leroy Wright. He was on the ground, not far from the second group, but he was dead. Instinctively, Benavidez removed from Wright's body all documents containing their unit's radio codes and call signs. It was at this point that everything went wrong. Even more wrong. First, a bullet hit him in the stomach, the 3rd shot he had endured. Then, a grenade exploded behind his back, with more shrapnel piercing his flesh. Worse still, the pilot was shot dead, and the helicopter crashed. Benavidez limped back to the wreckage and was able to extract his wounded comrades. Their only path to safety was to call in another airstrike and get another chopper. But first, he quickly set up a defense perimeter, all the while encouraging, directing, and caring for the wounded men. Jets and helicopter gunships finally returned to harass the enemy. By this time, Benavidez was almost rendered blind from all of the blood in his eyes, so he had to rely on his sense of hearing to direct the airstrikes. The new rescue chopper, it finally landed. Benavidez carried his comrades to the safety of the helicopter, one at a time. During the second trip, while he was shoving Frenchie Bissot on board, an NVA soldier closed up to him and clubbed him on the jaw with the butt of his rifle. Benavidez fell, then got up just in time to stop the soldier's bayonet with his bare right hand. The Vietnamese man managed to slash his left forearm before Benavidez fought back with his Bowie knife, stabbing him multiple times. After having secured Frenchie on board, Benavidez spotted 2 more NVA troops advancing, shooting the chopper. He grabbed an AK-47 and fired at them, silencing them for good. His mission was not finished, though. With the little remaining strength in his body, Benavidez rushed back to the defense perimeter to rescue the last Montagnard and all the classified documents. Benavidez, at this point, was in critical condition. He was bleeding from numerous wounds, and he was blinded by the blood hemorrhaging in his eyes. He also had a dislocated jaw, his intestines were exposed because of the gunshot in his abdomen, and he was having to hold them in with his hands. But everybody else was safe, so he allowed himself to be pulled into the chopper. En route to Loc Ninh, Benavidez closed his eyes.
Gunships had been ordered to escort the rescue chopper home. The gunship pilots reported that blood was dripping out of both doors of the rescue chopper and onto the jungle floor below. Lying on his back, Benavidez held his guts in with his own hands for the 20-minute ride back to the base.
And I was crying, I was moving so much that the co-pilot, he happened to look back and he thought that I was gasping for air, so he gets out of his seat, get his bayonet out, and he's going to do a track on me, and I'm about to kick him out of the helicopter. That's just too much for one day.
This 32-year-old son of a Texas sharecropper had just fought for 6 hours, suffered 7 serious gunshot wounds, 28 shrapnel wounds, a broken jaw, 2 bayonet wounds, a collapsed lung, and a piece of shrapnel embedded in his heart, was triaged and placed with the dead.
When the chopper landed at the field hospital, the medics tended to the wounded immediately and collected the bodies of the dead soldiers. One at a time, they were placed in body bags. Amongst them was Staff Sergeant Raul Roy Benavidez, codename Tango Mike. Jerry Cottingham, a friend, recognized Roy's body and screamed, "That's Benavidez! Get a doc!" When the doctor arrived, he placed a hand on Roy's chest to check for a heartbeat. He shook his head, saying, "There's nothing I can do for him." The doctor proceeded to zip up the body bag. Half of Sergeant Benavidez's body had already been swallowed by the sinister black bag. Then the doctor, closing the zipper, had the surprise of his life. The body of Benavidez spat at him. The surprised doctor reversed Roy's condition from dead to "he won't make it, but will try." Roy had not surrendered. He was in critical condition, having suffered more than 30 wounds. He could not talk because of the broken jaw, and his eyes had been sealed shut by congealed blood. But Benavidez was still alive. Unable to communicate otherwise, he spat to attract the doctor's attention, and it had worked. Staff Sergeant Benavidez had saved the lives of 8 men to great personal sacrifice. He spent almost a year in hospitals to recover from his injuries.
It makes me feel great when I put my uniform. That's the best piece of clothing I ever owned. Hey, and I wear it all the time. I don't care what other people think. They don't think I have civilian clothes. I don't care. No, because, you know, it's great to be in uniform. At least I get to show the taxpayer where his money goes. And I get a haircut every Friday, whether I need it or not. We in the Special Forces are trained to operate deep behind enemy lines with little or no support at all. We are trained in 5 specialties. I'm trained in 3. Operation Intelligence, where I learn oceanography, meteorology, photography. I'm an interrogator and I'm a linguist. I'm trained in light and heavy weapons and cross-trained as a medic. I've been all over the world, the Far East, Europe, South and Central America, and 2 tours in Vietnam. I was assigned to Berlin, Germany, and I was declared one time that I was the only Hispanic American that could speak German with a southern accent. They found out I loaded 3 dead enemy soldiers in that helicopter. I didn't want to leave anybody behind.
War is an ugly thing, but not the ugliest of things. A man who has nothing which he cares about more than his personal safety is a miserable creature and has no chance of being free unless made and kept so by the exertions of better men than himself. Sergeant Benavidez, a nation grateful to you and to all your comrades living and dead, awards you its highest symbol of gratitude. For service above and beyond the call of duty, the Congressional Medal of Honor.
We gotta get this over with so we can take a nap tonight. Thank you. How do they say? They say thank you in English, danke schön in German, merci beaucoup in French, arigato ne in Japanese. They say come on in Vietnam, and then they say muchas gracias in Spanish. So I don't speak all those languages, but I tell you one darn thing, if I'm ever around the country, I never go hungry, I'll get lost. I'm glad you asked if I'm married or not. I've been married Yes, I've been married twice. I was married to the Army for over 20 years, and the girl that lived with me married me. Do I have any children? What country? No. You know, and the good Lord spared my life for a reason. And I hope there's a reason. Any other questions? I'm not charging for questions.
He did administer morphine to his comrades, but never to himself, otherwise he would not have had the lucidity necessary to plan on the spot the defense perimeter, to retrieve the intel, to fight back against the NVA soldiers. Sustain 6 hours of intense fighting, but most of all, 6 hours of brilliant tactical leadership and medical and evacuation work. But his days of fighting, they weren't quite done. Shortly before Memorial Day 1983, Roy Benavidez released statements to warn that the Social Security Administration planned to cut off disability payments to him and other Vietnam War veterans. "I don't like to use my Medal of Honor for political purposes or personal gain, but if they can do this to me, what will they do to all the others?" 10 days after Roy's statements to the press, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Margaret M. Hackler, said the disability reviews would become more humane and compassionate. In 1983, the court overturns the initial decision and sanctions that Benavidez continued receiving payments. It was an important precedent that would help many more veterans.
Quoting General George Patton when he said, "It is foolish and wrong to mourn the men who are wounded and killed. Rather, we should thank God that such men exist." A man by the name of Roy Perez Benavidez.